In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Angelus Domini nunciavit Mariae.
Et concepit Dei Spiritus Sancto.
Ave Maria, gratia plena Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesu.
Ecce Sancta
Ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et in hora mortis nostrae. Amen. Ecce ancilla Domini. Ave Maria, gratia plena Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesu. Et verbum caro factum est, et habitabit in nobis. Ave Maria, gratia plena Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesu. Ora pro nobis Sancta Dei Genitrix.
ut digni et Christi.
Oremus. Gratiam tuam quaesimus, Domine, mentibus nostris infunde, ut qui angelo nuntiante Christi Filii tui incarnationem coniovimus, per passionem eius et crucem ad resurrectionis gloriam perducamur, per amdem Christum Dominum nostrum. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. So you guys had 2 weeks break. I'm sure you're all well caught up on the readings. And you've more than read these chapters 1 through 3 of book 1 of Nicomachean Ethics, correct? Exactly. So does anybody remember how I kind of explained and introduced the Nicomachean Ethics at the beginning of this course a little bit? Nicomachean.
Was his son.
Nicomacheus was his son, or Nicomachus was his son. And why did Aristotle write this book? Exactly, teach him how to be happy. And so I think one of the things today that a lot of people don't ever relate one to the other is ethics with happiness. A lot of people think of ethics as just like this sort of moral boundary, this moral code where you can do this, but you can't do that. If you go outside these boundaries, oh, you're just a bad person. And so we get to judge you and condemn you and just label you as like an outcast from society. It's just a way to, in a sense, categorize people and exclude people. But a lot of people don't really consider ethics isn't just what not to do. Ethics is, in fact, what to do. What to do. And we actually distinguish between these two different aspects in theology, because all theology is technically just dogmatic theology, divine revelation. But especially in the Roman tradition, we have subcategories. So we have dogmatic theology, that is everything that's divinely revealed, all that is de fide, of the faith. But then we have the things of what not to do, which is moral theology. But then, different from moral theology, we have the things to do, which is spiritual theology, otherwise known as ascetical and mystical theology, which is actually one of my favorite things to study because, well, it's like how to get closer to God, how to love Him, how to fall in love with Him, what the things to do. Because everything, when we think of theology or moral theology or ethics or stuff like that, as simply in the negative, we can tend to just categorize people. I mean, maybe we all know some people who study St. Alphonsus Liguori, whatever else, and just use these studies, their intellectual abilities, to then just kind of, well, not to use a negative pejorative term, but just to throw stones at people, just to condemn people, just to say, oh, look how bad this person is not behaving this in this way, they're just bad, avoid them. But never do we actually look at the positive thing, being like, this person is capable of happiness, because they're a human being, they're capable of happiness. Well, how do we help them actually grow towards this capacity, help them achieve this capacity that they have of being happy? Because ultimately, that's their fundamental desire, is to be happy. And so this is one of the things that is never really in question in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. He has at the very outset, what is ethics for? He's going to say, it's for happiness. And so he's actually going to talk about, from the very beginning, about the definition of happiness, because that's also up in question. Where is happiness? Where is it? How do we achieve it in this life? So in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics opens books 1 with the assertion that every human action, inquiry, craft, and pursuit aims at some good. We act because we want to do something good, something positive. Some goods are subordinate to others. Riddle making serves horsemanship. Horsemanship serves military strategy, and strategy serves the political art. If there exists an ultimate end desired entirely for its own sake, and never for the sake of something else, that end would be the highest good achievable by action. Now, what does it mean to do something for its own sake? What does it
Don't
mean?
expect any reward from it.
Okay, what else? That there's not some motive or reason beyond that act itself. Right? So, say you're hungry and you want to eat food because your stomach is rumbling and you want that pain to cease, right? But why do you want that pain to cease? Just for the sake of it ceasing? You want to be comfortable. You want to relax. You want maybe proper nutrition. You want to be hydrated. You want to be well nourished because maybe you're also an athlete, right? And you have to consume more than the normal 2,000 calories a day diet or whatever they have on the back of the cereal box, You have to consume 6,000 calories a day because you want to compete. And you want to compete because you want a gold medal. And you want a gold medal because of the prize money that comes with a gold medal, and then the honors of you being on the front of the Wheaties box because you won a gold medal. And you want to be on the front of the Wheaties box because you get other endorsements and you get more money. And you get more money because you finally get the house that you want, that $1 million house in Malibu, right? Because then once you get the $1 million house in Malibu, you get all the parties you want, and finally have all the room to invite all the people you want, all the celebrities you want. Because ultimately you think, what? What is all this for? To be happy. And why do you want to be happy? For something else? Beyond it? Exactly. So to do something for its own sake is to do something for it ultimately, for no other reason other than that thing itself. So again, you were hungry. We started with just mere hunger. And somehow we ended up in a house in Malibu with a bunch of people around. So that's how it desires still lead for another desire, to another desire, to another desire, to another desire. But ultimately there's an ultimate desire to which we desire for nothing else, for its own sake, for itself, nothing beyond it. Does that make sense? The science that studies and orders this highest good, here's something interesting. The science that, of all these 12 pages of notes, here's one thing that's interesting. The science that studies and orders this highest good is politics. Politics. For it determines which sciences belong in the city, what each person should learn, and what the ultimate aim or purpose of the best human life should be. Aristotle begins the Nicomachean ethics with a sweeping empirical observation that is meant to command immediate assent. Every deliberate human activity, whether it be a practical craft, a theoretical inquiry, a moral choice, or even a casual pursuit, appears to aim at some good. Nobody does something unless they thought it was something good, even when they do something evil. Even when they do something absolutely abhorrently evil. If you create death camps to shove 11 million people in, you're doing it probably to save Europe, and because you think that's something good. No one does something evil for evil's sake. They do something evil because they think that action has some sort of good consequence. Of course, they're perverted and they're erroneous in their idea if it's to some extreme. But they're doing it because they perceive some sort of good coming out of it. Everybody acts to do something good. This is why we need to form our consciences, because our conscience fundamentally tells us we should do good and we should not do evil. But what we need to form our consciences in is what is good and what is evil. That isn't natural. That we have to receive formation on. But the innate conscience in each and every single one of us, that which is written on our heart, is that we should do good and should avoid evil. The Greek word for end or goal here is telos. We talked about this when we talked about the final causality. And the word for good is agathon. You don't need to know that particularly, but there they are. Aristotle is claiming that whenever human beings act intentionally, they always act for the sake of something that they believe, at least at that moment, to be good for them or good in itself. This is not yet a moral claim. It is a structural claim about the teleological character of human action. Teleological. Am I losing you on that word?
Nope. It's the end result.
Or what you ultimately aim for. So it is a structural claim about the teleological character of a human action, what your action is supposed to be for, what you actually want to accomplish. So action is never aimless. It is always directed toward an object conceived as desirable. An object conceived as desirable. And of course, when we were talking about, studying his book De Anima, what is the motive to move an animated object? An animal, a soul that is capable of self-motion is desire, right? To illustrate the point, Aristotle immediately introduces the idea of hierarchy among ends. Many goods are instrumental and subordinate. Like I said before, the bridle maker produces bridles not for their own sake, but for the sake of horsemanship. The horseman rides well, not ultimately for riding's sake, but to serve the general in military strategy. The general wages war successfully for the sake of victory and political power. Each lower art or activity is orchestrated under a higher one, and each practitioner looks up to the end of the superior art. This pattern of subordination cannot go on indefinitely. Otherwise, human life would be an infinite regress of means with no ultimate meaning. Therefore, and this kind of sums it up if you were kind of getting lost in this paragraph. Therefore, Aristotle reasons, there must be a highest architectonic, some sort of design, someone designing. There must be a highest architectonic end that is not pursued as a means to anything further. An end that is complete, self-sufficient, and choice-worthy, worthy of being chosen, entirely for itself. If such an end exists, it will be the supreme human good, the ultimate good for man. Again, he concludes with if. I always like to say it doesn't. He doesn't assume that we're just going to ultimately agree with him. He says, this is the landscape here. If this happens, and this. And then, of course, he continues to write. Aristotle then identifies the science whose proper object is precisely this ultimate architectonic good, political science. Now, for those of us, who watch Fox News or CNN or whatever else, a lot of us think policy is a bunch of people, arguing for power and all that kind of stuff. But Aristotle here is going to propose political science as something more real, practical. And I think once we see what political science was for the philosophers, we're kind of going to feel a little bit more depressed when we hear some political science analysts or whatever else on the news or whatever, because we see how far they are from the actual objective of what political science is supposed to be. So Aristotle then identifies the science whose proper object is precisely this ultimate architectonic good, political science, or simply politics, in the broad Greek sense that includes both statesmanship and legislation. Politics is the master art, because it is not one specialized craft among others. Rather, it prescribes which crafts and sciences are to be admitted into the city at all, how they are to be practiced, by whom, and to what extent. For example, it decides whether flute playing or geometry should be taught to free citizens, whether medicine or shipbuilding should be publicly funded, and how much time young people should devote to taekwondo versus music. Most importantly, politics determines the final goal of all these subordinate activities. It sets the overarching aim of human life and community. The final goal of all these subordinate activities, it sets the overarching aim of human life and community, which is one of the reasons why, the United States is a melting pot, and why American identity is so important, because we don't necessarily have this. We have so many people coming from so many different backgrounds, from so many directions. Ultimately, what is our aim? Where are we going? Who are we? That's one of the things that in the United States we've commonly struggled with. We can't exist just to be different. Because its scope is universal and its end is the most final of all ends, politics, and the ethical inquiry subordinate to it, enjoys unrivaled dignity. Ethics, therefore, is not an autonomous discipline, but a branch of political science. concerned with the good for the individual only insofar as the individual's good is inseparable from the common good of the polis, of the city. Let me read that again. Ethics, therefore, is not an autonomous discipline, but a branch of political science, concerned with the good for the individual only insofar as the individual's good is inseparable from the common good of the polis. So a lot of people are constantly saying, you can't legislate morality. That's the very purpose. That's the very purpose of legislation. It's its very purpose. This opening move is subtle, but momentous. By locating the study of the highest human good within politics, rather than, say, metaphysics or contemplative philosophy, Aristotle signals that the good he is seeking is practical and achievable by action, not a transcendent form or a purely theoretical object. It is practical and achievable. It is a good for embodied, social, time-bound human beings living together in cities. The entire Nicomachean ethics will unfold under the authority of this architectonic science and the famous definition of happiness that emerges later. That definition is this: activity of soul in accordance with complete virtue in a complete or full life will ultimately be justified by its place within the ordered hierarchy of human ends crowned by the political art. Most people, when asked what this highest good is, okay, we're gonna have to practice saying this. Eudaimonia.
Eudaimonia.
Well, it's kind of funny, when I was learning Italian, I saw one of the Italian sisters on the phone talking to somebody, and she was like, die, 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 die. And I'm like, sister, you're a little over-exaggerating here. But D-A-I in Italian means come on. So she's like, come on, come on, come on, come on, come on. But she was like, die, 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 die. So when I was looking at this word, how to explain it, it's like eudaimonia. Eudaimonia. Pretend like you're playing a video game. Like eudaimonia. Anyway. The highest good is called eudaimonia, a term usually rendered as happiness, but more accurately understood as flourishing, living well, and doing well. Okay, yeah, I'll get to that later. Many people, and the vulgar, people that are vulgar, identify eudaimonia with pleasure, and accordingly live the life of gratification. Cultivated political men identify it with honor, since honor seems to be the goal of the political life. Yet, honor depends on those who grant it, rather than belonging properly to the one honored. And it seems too superficial to be the ultimate good. This was actually one of the crises that I had when I was in Nashville as a professional guitar player, because one of the things you want to be when you're a professional guitar player and get on stage and go on tours and all that kind of stuff is you want to be famous. You want to be well known. You want to walk into a restaurant and be like, oh my gosh, can I take a picture? Oh my goodness, right? You want to be famous. You want to be well known. But I realized that if I ever traveled to, like, I don't know, Japan, Africa, South Africa, Zimbabwe, the chances of that happening were like zero. Why? Because your sphere of influence of your fame is constrained to a certain demographic, a certain group, right? And so this honor wasn't able to be achieved, in a sense, everywhere. So like this whole pursuit of honor, I realized that there would be some places where that happiness, or actually rather, that there would be people that would not be giving me that happiness that I desired. In other words, happiness was in somebody else's hands to give me. Happiness was in somebody else's hands to give me. If they didn't give me it, then it was out of my control. And that was another one of my crises. Like, is happiness in my control or is it somebody else's control? And this is what I constantly have to, counsel married couples with too, because a lot of people blame their spouse for not making them happy. It's like, whoa. Sounds like Adam in the garden. The woman you put here in the garden, first of all, he blames God. First, the woman you put here in the garden with me, she gave me the apple to eat. Always launching the blame on somebody else, right? No, actually, as we continue to know, happiness is in your own hands. It's how you live your marriage, regardless of what the other person does. Regardless of what the other person does. Where was I? You guys distracted me. Okay. Cultivated political man identify with honor. Okay, we did this. A few thinkers, echoing Plato, have proposed that the good itself is a single separate idea beyond all particular goods, like outside of this whole material realm, all that kind of stuff, in the realm of ideas. That was Plato. But Aristotle rejects this notion as empty and irrelevant to a practical human life. You know what I mean by practical? Things you could actually do, things that are actually relevant to our life, like you picking up that book is something practical, something practical you can do. There remain three principal candidates for what the best life means. Three principal candidates, or three options of what the best life or what happiness could mean. A life of pleasure, wealth. The political life, which is honor. And the contemplative life, which we will examine later. Cliffhanger. So those three options: life of pleasure, life of honor, or the contemplative life. Aristotle next turns from the formal structure of human action to the actual content that people give to the highest good. When ordinary Greeks are asked, pretend you're a Greek here for a second. When ordinary Greeks are asked what the ultimate aim of life is, almost everyone answers with the same word: eudaimonia. This is the condition that parents wish for their children, that friends toast at banquets, that statesmen claim to secure for the city. The English word happiness is a misleading translation, because it suggests a transient feeling of contentment or pleasure. Transient. What does transient mean?
Comes and goes.
It's just here 1 second and gone the next. So you go to Disneyland, you ride on the roller coaster, great time, right? And then the next day, that feeling, it's gone, you want to go up again. You have to go up again. You have to try to perpetuate this feeling, right? So you keep doing it again and again and again and again and again, not realizing that you want an eternal happiness, something that lasts, but you think doing something temporary will somehow equal, like 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1 will equal affinity. Doesn't happen. Eudaimonia is far more objective and enduring. It is a state of a human life that has turned out well, that is flourishing, that is worthy of choice and admiration. A person who has eudaimonia is not merely feeling good. He is living and acting in the way that fully realizes his human potential. There is a saint that's, I think it was St. Irenaeus, said, the glory of God is man fully alive. The glory of God is man fully alive. Because of course, that glory of God is precisely him taking that which he made out of dust, a human being, and imitating his very life, living his very life, which is ultimately our happiness, our beatitude. A person who has eudaimonia is not merely feeling good. He is living and acting in the way that fully realizes his human potential. Yet, although nearly everyone agrees on the name eudaimonia for happiness, they disagree sharply on what it consists in. Aristotle surveys three broad classes of opinion, each corresponding to a distinct way of life. The first and most common view belongs to the many, hoi polloi. That's how you say it in Greek, hoi polloi. I'm sure some of us have heard those words before. The ordinary, uneducated crowd. So if you get called hoi polloi, it's not exactly a compliment, guys. Polloi. For them, eudaimonia is simply pleasure, hedone. You might have heard the name hedonistic. Here we go, it's simply pleasure, hedonistic. Especially bodily pleasure, eating, drinking, sex, entertainment. Their ideal is a life of gratification or enjoyment. Aristotle does not treat this view with contempt. He acknowledges that pleasure is naturally attractive and that even animals pursue it. I don't know if that's a plus or a minus, but anyway. Still, he regards it as slavish and fit only for grazing cattle, because a life devoted to sensation cannot be distinctly human. Why can it not be distinctly human?
Because you have an intellect and you have a soul.
Right, so Aristotle's looking for what is uniquely human. What is it about our human nature that is different from animals, from plants? Because as we went through the three different types of life, we had vegetative life, sentient or animal life, and then human, rational life, right? And so in each one there was differences, distinctions. And so there has to be something in an animal's happiness that is distinct from a plant's happiness. And therefore also something different from a rational animal's happiness, a human person's happiness, than there is from an animal's happiness. So if the very actions that cause happiness can be achieved by an animal, it's not uniquely human. The animals share it with us, that same happiness. Does that make sense? So ultimately, what Aristotle's going to be reasoning to is ultimately our intellect and how that plays into what happiness is. So the second view is held by refined, ambitious, and politically active men, the sort who hold office, lead armies, and receive public honors. They identify eudaimonia with honor, the esteem and recognition granted by others. The political life is therefore oriented toward winning and maintaining high reputation. Aristotle concedes that honor is closer to the truth than pleasure is, because honor is at least bestowed for something, usually for perceived virtue or excellence. Nevertheless, honor cannot be the ultimate good. First, it is external. It depends on the judgment and goodwill of those who confer it, not on the inner quality of the honored person himself. So honor exists in a sense outside of you. It comes to you. It doesn't exist inside of you. It's not part of you. Second, political men typically seek honor as proof that they are virtuous, which implies that virtue, not honor, is the more fundamental object of pursuit. Honor is therefore a sign or consequence, not the thing itself. Not the thing itself. A third, more sophisticated opinion comes from philosophers influenced by Plato's theory of forms. They claim that there exists a single transcendent idea of the good, separate from all particular goods, in which everything else participates. Aristotle will devote 2 full chapters to dismantling this theory, but here he dismisses it briefly. Even if such a universal good existed, it would be useless for practical life. Human beings need to know what the good is for us, the good we can achieve by action in this world, not an eternal paradigm that no one can possess or imitate directly. So here we come back to the 3 options. After clearing away these inadequate accounts, Aristotle quietly introduces the tripartite scheme that will structure much of the rest of the ethics. There are 3 primary candidates for the best human life. The life of gratification, pleasure, is the way of the many. The political life, honor and practical virtue, is the way of distinguished statesmen. The third possibility, which he mentions only in passing here, is the contemplative life, the life devoted to understanding and wisdom. The contemplative life, the life devoted to understanding and wisdom. Aristotle does not yet say which of these is truly best. He will argue later that contemplation is the highest activity. But by naming it alongside the others, he signals that the ultimate answer may not lie with the conventional options of pleasure or political honor. The stage is thus set for the inquiry that will occupy the next 10 books. And this is the question: what exactly is a human good, and which life most perfectly realizes it? What exactly is the human good, and which life most perfectly realizes it? Ethics, as a branch of politics, cannot be an exact science like mathematics. Its subject matter admits of much variation and holds only for the most part. Listeners who lack experience or who are young in character are poor students of it, because they follow their passions rather than reason argument. Precision beyond what the material allows would be misplaced. One of the things that was interesting that I was learning about Aristotle when I was taught in Italy is very much the teacher emphasized that Aristotle very much insisted that those who study his ethics would already be leading some sort of life of virtue. Because if you're living a hedonistic life, you're not going to accept the conclusions that he draws. If he rationally proves why you need to be temperate in your physical behavior and not indulge, to use theological terms here, sins of the flesh, if you're doing that, then you're probably going to argue against it, even though he just rationally proved that this is not something virtuous. And so, in one sense, he didn't have the patience for that sort of thing. It's like the only way you can actually reason to these ultimate conclusions is if you have some sort of preparation or disposition to fall in the conclusions to where they go, regardless of how they're going to affect your life. And so this is actually one of the important things about philosophy too, is that ultimately, if you're truly a philosopher, you're going to have to live according to your conclusions. You're going to have to ultimately live according to your conclusions. So studying philosophy in and of itself should change the way you live, naturally. So Aristotle pauses after sketching the grand scope of his inquiry to issue a crucial methodological warning. The study of the human good, what we must do and what sort of persons we must become in order to flourish, belongs to political science. But it is not and cannot be an exact or demonstrative discipline on the model of mathematics or theoretical physics. In geometry, theorems are always and necessarily true. The definitions are stipulative. What does stipulative mean? That's a big word. Stipulative means a declaration of a meaning that is intended to be attached by the speaker to a word, expression, or symbol, and that usually does not already have an established use in the sense intended. So just a definite word. And the conclusions follow with logical compulsion from self-evident axioms. Ethics, by contrast, deals with human actions, feelings, habits, and circumstances, all of which are mutable, changeable, contingent, are but don't have to be, and shot through with individual differences. In other words, what is just or courageous in one situation may be unjust or reckless in another. What benefits one temperament or constitution may harm another. Therefore, ethical statements are true only for the most part. They describe what usually happens with decently brought up people under ordinary conditions, but they always admit of exceptions. In moral theology, we have the three distinctions: object, intention, and circumstances. Object, intention, of circumstances. And there are many different circumstances. Who, what, when, where, why, by what means. The object is the act itself. So if one of the three is wrong, the whole action is wrong. So there's the object, which is what the action is done, is the actual action. The intention, it could be a good object, but if you do it with a bad intention, the whole act is wrong. And the circumstances, by the means in the situations, all that kind of stuff is done. So for instance, if you take medicine to be healed, fine. But if that medicine you take for your healing was tested on or used a cell line that used cells from an aborted fetus, morally impermissible. Morally impermissible. And knowingly taking that, immoral. So when one thing is wrong, the whole thing is wrong. If the object itself is wrong, this is what's called intrinsically evil, an act that is always and everywhere 100% impermissible. You can't do it at all. But then intention is always the funny thing, is because you could do a good act, but with the wrong intention. Like I get up early in the morning so I can go to work, and seems super virtuous because I'm going to get my work done, all that kind of stuff. But it's really so I don't have to bother with helping get the kids ready in the morning. Not helping my wife get the kids ready in the morning. I just kind of want to escape. You know, she really needs your help, all that kind of stuff, but you just want to get out of there, you know, because kids are annoying, whatever. Intention's not exactly that good, is it? So the whole act, not that good. Even though the rest of it seemed, public face, it seemed a fine act, but no. So object, intention, and circumstances. This built-in variability has immediate consequences for how the subject should be taught and learned. Aristotle insists that no one should expect or even desire more precision than the subject matter permits. To demand apodictic, or in other words, expressing or the nature of necessary truth or absolute certainty. To demand absolute certainty in ethics would be as foolish as demanding it in medicine or navigation. A doctor who refused to treat a patient until every variable was mathematically fixed would watch the patient die. And a helmsman, or a ship captain, who waited for absolute predictability would never leave port. Ethical theory must remain rough-edged and outline-like, offering general signposts rather than a rigid blueprint. And we see this often. A lot of people forget this principle because a lot of people will, again, point fingers, throw stones, whatever else. But in the confessional, where you're free to dispose your conscience to the confessor, he's the one that sits in judgment, learning all of the circumstances, learning the intentions, and learning the object to then finally decide whether this act was moral or not. The same variability explains why certain kinds of students are unsuited to lectures on ethics. Young people are often immature. Just kidding. Young people are often immature in judgment because they have not yet lived long enough to observe the full range of human fortunes and consequences. More importantly, Aristotle adds, some people are young in character, regardless of their age. They are impulsive, governed by appetite and emotion, rather than by reasoned deliberation. Such listeners chase powerful feelings, anger, erotic desire, ambition, fear, and treat philosophy as just another arena in which to win applause or gratify curiosity. They are, in effect, still slaves to passion, and therefore deaf to arguments that require stepping back from immediate desire. A person who has never suffered loss, faced real moral risk, or watched virtuous friends endure misfortune cannot yet grasp what is actually at stake in questions of courage, justice, or the good life. A person who has not suffered serious loss, faced real moral risk, or watched virtuous friends endure misfortune cannot yet grasp what is actually at stake in questions of courage, justice, or the good life. Good moral education, Aristotle implies, presupposes a certain amount of lived experience, and above all, the prior formation of decent habits. Only someone who already inclines towards the noble, and away from the base will be able to follow, test, and eventually appropriate the reasoned account of the virtues that the ethics will offer. I'm reading this book for a podcast that I'm doing called The Restoration of Christian Culture by John Senior. John Senior was he was a professor, university professor, very popular because a lot of his students,
Kansas State?
University of Kansas.
University.
He created a humanities course at the University of Kansas that ended up having so many converts to the Catholic faith. I think there was a Jewish student that converted to the Catholic faith, and the father, of course, went to the university and threatened to shut them down or whatever else because he'd stop giving them money if they didn't shut it down or whatever else because his Jewish son converted to Catholicism. But there was several of these students that also went to Benedictine monasteries, became priests. I think two of them right now are bishops of the United States, Archbishop Coakley in Oklahoma City and Bishop Conley in Lincoln, Nebraska. But John Senior wrote this book called The Restoration of Christian Culture, in which he explains that even as children shouldn't be fed immediately St. Thomas Aquinas and theology and philosophy, They should be fed fairy tales, stories, poems, because it's this desire for wonder that awakens in them the desire for that which is true, good, and beautiful. That will then is the soil that you could then plant the seeds that are philosophy and theology in them, that it could then flourish. But the problem is in our society, we have tablets, iPhones, video games, movies, none of which actually foster the sense of wonder. And so when we try to teach people theology and philosophy, it's seeds falling on rock, as in the parable, seeds falling on rock, or at least in the thorn bushes, where when they do grow, the passion and desire, which is the thorns, eventually kill it. So in our society, we're very much lacking that which prepares people to study ethics, to study morality. The lectures are addressed not to moral blank slates or to passionate adolescents, but to mature men of practical experience who are already well brought up, and who now seek a clearer, more articulate understanding of what they have dimly sensed through a life of action. For everyone else, ethical theory will either be unintelligible or, worse, turned into a new instrument for self-deception and sophistry, subtly deceptive reasoning or argumentation. This sober restriction on the audience is one of the most distinctive and challenging features of Aristotle's ethical project. It's not for everyone. PG-13. Aristotle then tests his emerging definition against common beliefs. Happiness, he provisionally concludes, turns out to be activity of the soul in accordance with complete virtue throughout a complete life, throughout an entire life, entirety. This accords with the view that happiness is virtue, or a certain kind of virtue. For the best activity requires the best state of character. It also explains why pleasure accompanies happiness. Since virtuous activity is inherently pleasant. Honor, wealth, and bodily pleasures are sought because they either enable virtuous activity or arise as its byproducts. The political man pursues honor chiefly as evidence that he possesses virtue. Yet, the truly happy man engages in virtuous activity for its own sake. So being virtuous simply to be virtuous. Being good simply to be good, and for no other reason. So having laid out the function argument in chapter 7 and arrived at the provisional definition of eudaimonia as activity of soul in accordance with the best and most complete virtue in a complete life, Aristotle immediately subjects this definition to a rigorous consistency check against the very opinions he had earlier defined and differentiated. It's pretty unusual, isn't it? He goes and checks himself against that, what he was trying to prove wrong. This is a hallmark of his dialectical method. A philosophical account is credible only if it can save or explain the reputable beliefs of ordinary and wise people alike. So first, the definition satisfies those who think happiness is identical with virtue itself. On Aristotle's view, virtue is not the whole of happiness, but its formal cause. Happiness is the actual exercise or activity that arises when a soul already possesses virtue, puts that stable disposition into operation. So here's the thing that's about virtue. It's a disposition, it's a habit. So you can do a virtuous act without necessarily possessing that virtue. But that's how you actually acquire the virtues, is by repeating the same act over and over and over, making it a habit. Virtue is a good habit. So just as a well-tuned lyre is good, a guitar player, lyre is an L-Y-R-E. I didn't think about how that would sound out loud. So just as a well-tuned guitar player is good, but the goodness of the guitar player consists in beautiful playing, so a virtuous character is good. But the human good is virtuous acting and living. Thus, the popular intuition that the best life is a life of the noble and good gentleman is preserved and clarified. The noble and good gentleman. Second, the definition explains why happiness is invariably accompanied by pleasure without reducing happiness to pleasure. Again, why happiness is invariably accompanied by pleasure without reducing happiness to pleasure. Virtuous activity, when performed by someone who loves what is good, is the most pleasant of all activities by its very nature. Of course, if someone loves what's doing good, then he's going to be happy doing what's good. The pleasure is not an added bonus or bait. It completes or perfects the activity the way the bloom of health perfects a body in its prime. This allows Aristotle to grant that the many are partly right. Happiness is supremely pleasant, while insisting that the vulgar are wrong to treat pleasure as a goal rather than a natural consequence of noble activity. I remember one time I was at a Burger King when I was a kid, and I was with my cousin and my aunt. And I don't know, there's some sort of older woman who was like with a walker or something, and she couldn't carry her Burger King tray to her seat or whatever. And just naturally, my cousin just sprung up and went and carried the tray or whatever to her seat, and came back, and he just had kind of just a look on his face. And his mom just looked at him and said, "Feel good, don't it?" And he was like, "Yeah." You know, he didn't just jump up and immediately react because he thought, "Oh, I'm going to feel good if I do this." He just went and did it, and then afterward, it just felt good. The pleasure accompanies the act. Third, the definition accounts for the pursuit of honor, wealth, and external goods without making any of them the substance of happiness. So this is what he just did. He's proving the people that were wrong partially right, but also explaining why they were wrong, where they went wrong. But he's at least explaining why they had reason to think what they thought. So third, the definition accounts for the pursuit of honor, wealth, and external goods without making any of them the substance of happiness. Honor is sought by serious political men because public recognition is the most visible testimony that one has, in fact, acted virtuously. Yet once virtue is understood as the inner principle of action, honor is demoted to a secondary and derivative object. In other words, a truly happy man does not perform good actions in order to be honored. He accepts honor when it comes because it confirms that others have correctly perceived the nobility of what he has done for its own sake. So the honor is merely a consequence, not, again, that which is sought for. Similarly, money, political power, friends, health, and good looks are necessary equipment. Good looks are necessary equipment. They provide the material conditions and opportunities without which sustained virtuous activity would be impossible or severely hampered. They are, in Aristotle's later terminology, necessary but not constituent parts of happiness. In other words, you can do a lot of good with these things. They're means to an end, not an end in and of themselves. They're a means to an end, not an end in and of themselves. Finally, the definition reveals the deeper structure behind the three lives introduced earlier. The life of pleasure mistakes the inseparable accompaniment, or pleasure, for the essence. The political life mistakes the external sign, honor, for the reality. Both are therefore fixated on byproducts, consequences, rather than on the activity itself. The contemplative life, by contrast, seeking understanding and wisdom, the contemplative life, by the contrast, will later be shown to be the most complete and self-sufficient form of the very same pattern. Activity of the best part of the soul in accordance with its own unique excellence. Thus, even at this early stage, Aristotle's formula quietly begins to elevate contemplation above the practical virtues of the statesman, while still granting the statesman a genuinely happy, if second best, life. The heart of Book 1, Chapter 7, is the celebrated function argument. Function argument. One of the most influential passages in the entire Aristotelian corpus. And again, I want to bring back to your mind material cause, formal cause, agent cause or efficient cause, and final cause. And all of this, again, links back to what we're talking about ethics. Like again, we started with the very principle, things exist. Remember at the beginning of this course, I just said, let's decide on this, things exist outside of our mind. And now we're talking about where's happiness. Now we're talking about where's happiness. And this is how it all connects together. Aristotle believes that to discover the human good, we must first identify what human beings, as a natural kind, are for. What human beings are for. What their distinctive work or purpose is. The reasoning is analogical and rests on a deeply teleological view of nature. Anything that has a characteristic activity or function is good when it performs that function well. And it performs it well when it displays the specific excellence proper to that function. So, if a tree produces fruit, is it a good tree? If a tree produces rotten fruit, is it a good tree? No. Bad tree. Cut it down. Our Lord did. Fig tree. Bad. To arrive at this definition, employing the famous function argument, Aristotle recalls that mere nutrition and growth are shared with plants. So our purpose isn't to eat. Some people look like it, but purpose isn't to eat. And perception and appetite with animals. What remains uniquely human is an active life of the element that has reason. Reason. Either the purely rational part or the part that, though not fully rational, can obey reason. The human good, therefore, is activity of soul in conformity with the excellence or virtue, and if there are several virtues, in conformity with the best and most complete virtue. Activity of soul in conformity with excellence or virtue, and if there are several virtues, in conformity with the best and most complete virtue. Aristotle begins with uncontroversial examples. He uses lyre, but again, I forgot how it sounded out loud, so I'm going to use guitar. A guitar player is not good simply because he owns a guitar or because he feels cheerful when holding it. He is good as a guitar player only when he plays the guitar beautifully. An eye that cannot see clearly is a defective eye. A knife that cannot cut is a bad knife. In each case, the goodness is tied to the excellent performance of the thing's characteristic activity. In each case, the goodness is tied to the excellent performance of the thing's characteristic activity. The question then becomes, does a human being, considered specifically as a human being, not as a carpenter or as a citizen, but as a human being, have a characteristic function in the same way? What do you guys think? Why is that? The question is, does a human being have a characteristic function in the same way as a knife? It's to cut. You guys? Yes, no? No? Too one-dimensional.
A human can do the same thing a knife can, but no, it's not the same properties of the knife.
I mean, we're not talking about specifically cutting.
Always to do good. If it doesn't do that, it's not a good human being.
Do we have a characteristic activity?
No.
I think it's ironic because you're all answering no, but you're all using that very characteristic activity. But anyway. Some might deny it, claiming that humans are aimless or that any purpose is arbitrarily imposed. Some might deny it, that we have a characteristic function in the same way, claiming that humans are aimless or purposeless, that any purpose is arbitrarily, randomly imposed. Aristotle rejects this. Aristotle rejects this. If plants, animals, and artifacts all display purposiveness, it would be strange if the human species alone lacked one. Everything else has purpose, except us. He therefore proceeds by subtraction to isolate what is uniquely human. He proceeds by subtraction to isolate what is uniquely human. Mere life, nutrition, growth, reproduction, is ruled out because plants already possess it. And we do not think that a flourishing cabbage has achieved the human good, as much as we all like cabbage and coleslaw. Next, sentient life. perception, locomotion, appetite, and the capacity for pleasure and pain. It is ruled out because horses, dogs, and oxen share these capacities. A life devoted only to sensation and desire would be indistinguishable from the life of a well-fed, grazed hippopotami. What remains, then, is the activity of that part of the soul which possesses reason. What's uniquely human is reason. What remains, then, is the activity of that part of the soul which possesses reason. Aristotle is careful here. The rational element in human beings has two aspects. One is purely contemplative or scientific, the part that exercises reason in itself and for its own sake. This will later be associated with Sophia, theoretical wisdom. The other is the calculative appetitive part that listens to and can obey reason. This will be associated with phronesis, the Greek word phronesis, practical wisdom, and with the moral virtues. A complete human life must actualize both dimensions. The one may be primary. So this is actually something that's different from the will, and the will is something that's talked about later on in scholastic philosophers. So the phronesis, the practical aspect of the intellect, is not quite. It's more of the prudence. It's the part of the intellect that deliberates. So deliberation is the act of, I have an end in mind, a goal that I want to achieve. And so I consider all of the options, all of the ways that I could achieve the goal. And the act of deliberation is to looking at all these options and seeing which one is the best way to achieve that goal. Does that make sense? The conclusion follows swiftly. If man has a function, his good will consists in performing that function well. To perform the rational activity well is to perform it in accordance with the excellence proper to it. And since there is a hierarchy among the excellences of the soul, some virtues are higher and more complete than others, the fullest human good will be activity of soul in accordance with the best and most complete virtue. Several crucial points are embedded in this compact argument. First, the good is not a static possession, wealth, health, even virtue as a mere disposition, but an activity, something exercised and lived. Second, human excellence is not arbitrary or conventional. It is rooted in our natural capacities and in the objective structure of the soul. Third, the argument is inclusive. It does not yet decide whether the best and most complete virtue is contemplation or the ensemble of practical virtues. That question will be settled only in Book 10, and we'll get there in a couple weeks. Finally, the function argument grounds ethics in a naturalistic yet non-reductive way. Human beings are not blank slates, nor are we disembodied intellects. We are rational animals, and our flourishing must respect both halves of that compound. Rational animals, both halves of it. You guys want to take a quick break? 10 minutes? Then we keep going. Just go on. You guys are brave. The function argument, therefore, transforms the vague, contested notion of eudaimonia into something precise and defensible. The excellent performance over a whole life of the distinctly human work of rational activity. The excellent performance over a whole life of the distinctively human work of rational activity. Now, maybe one of the aspects that some of you may have gotten confused on in terms of purpose is many of us ask ourselves, what's my unique purpose? I mean, we're all unique individual human beings, right? We're unique souls, unrepeatable, all that kind of stuff. And oftentimes when we're going through life, we're asking, like, what am I supposed to do with my life? What am I, am I supposed to be a professional guitar player? Am I supposed to be a priest? What am I supposed to do in life? But here we're just talking about human nature in general, right? And our natural capacity. So we all have the use of reason. And so that's particularly what we're looking at. What is the purpose of reason? What is it for? What is our intellect for? Everything that follows in the Nicomachean ethics, the doctrine of the mean, the individual virtues, friendship, pleasure, and the ultimate primacy of contemplation, can be seen as an extended commentary on what this excellent rational activity looks like in practice. So here we go. Happiness is not simply a state or possession, but an activity. Happiness as an activity. And it requires a complete or total life. For a single day or a short time does not make a person blessed and happy. So it requires the entirety of life, not just a moment. It also requires at least a moderate supply of external goods: health, friends, wealth, good birth, good children. Because human virtue is the virtue of a composite being, not a disembodied intellect. Nevertheless, the good man will bear misfortunes nobly and will always make the best of his circumstances, just as a good general uses the army at his disposal to best effect. So he'll explain a little bit later on, because was it last class or maybe, no, it was my sermon. I mentioned Boethius in discussing maybe St. Augustine, how he basically died the same death of Socrates. He was a philosopher. He translated a lot of Aristotle's works into Latin. And of course, being a philosopher and trying to be good, he was a little bit combative to the political authorities in his day, and they decided to condemn him to death. And so he was just, sitting in his cell. He wrote the book Consolation of Philosophy, very incredible philosophical work, very beautiful. He personified philosophy as lady philosophy, as this woman that comes to him in his cell to comfort him and give him comfort for dying, for being good, for dying, for being virtuous. So in the sense, everything can still be stripped away from you, 100% of things. This was also explaining in my sermon. I mean, your health can be taken away from you, your spouse can be taken away from you, your children can be taken away from you, your house can be taken away from you, your job can be taken away from you, your money can be taken away from you. Everything in this world where you say, oh, if I have X, Y, and Z, then I can be happy. All of it, one tornado, bam, gone. But you can still be happy even in those circumstances. Well, that's what our faith tells us, and it's true. So Aristotle now adds three crucial qualifications to his definition of happiness, each of which protects it from common misunderstandings and anchors it firmly in the real conditions of human existence. First, happiness is not a passive state or a fixed possession that one can acquire once and for all, like money in the bank, or even virtue conceived as a settled disposition. You can make the habit of being virtuous, but then you also can make the habit of not being virtuous. Like you can practice a virtuous act over and over and over, so it becomes habit. But then you can stop doing it or do its opposite, and then lose the disposition. It is an activity or praxis that must be continuously exercised. A person who has all the virtues but is asleep, imprisoned, or paralyzed is not living happily at the moment, however admirable his character may be. It's a funny saying in Latin, qui vivit dormit, qui dormit non peccat, qui non peccat sanctus est, ergo qui vivit sanctus est. You guys took my Latin class, right? Whoever drinks, sleeps. Whoever sleeps doesn't sin. Whoever doesn't sin is holy. Therefore, whoever drinks is holy. Not exactly, right? Happiness is the ongoing actualization of those virtues in thought, choice, and action. This is why Aristotle later insists that the happy man lives well and does well. The good life is not a prize awarded at the end, but the very shape of a life that is being nobly lived. The good life is not a prize awarded at the end, but the very shape of a life that is being nobly lived. Second, happiness requires a complete or a whole, entire life. One brilliant day, one heroic deed, or 1 year of prosperity is not enough. Just as a single swallow does not make a spring, a brief spell of virtuous activity does not yet constitute eudaimonia. The reason is partly empirical. Fortune can always reverse itself, but more profoundly, it reflects the nature of human excellence. Virtues of character are stable dispositions that reveal themselves only over time. through repeated choices in varied circumstances. Courage is not proven in a single battle. Justice is not displayed in one transaction. Magnanimity needs a long career in which great opportunities and great dangers both arise. A child cannot be called happy, not because children are miserable, but because their lives are incomplete and their characters unformed. The full verdict on a human life can only be rendered when the drama is over. Third, and most realistically, Aristotle refuses to detach happiness from the external conditions without which sustained virtuous activity becomes impossible or grotesquely difficult. Human beings are not pure intellects or Platonic souls temporarily trapped in bodies. We are essentially rational animals, both composite beings whose rational activity is interwoven with bodily, social, and material needs. To act generously, one needs at least some money. To act courageously, one needs a healthy body and legitimate occasions for risk. To exercise justice, one needs fellow citizens and a police. To practice friendship, one needs friends. To bring up children well, one needs decent offspring and sufficient resources. Aristotle is blunt. Without a moderate supply of external goods, health, wealth, friends, good birth, good children, and even a degree of physical attractiveness, happiness is either impossible or severely impaired. Total destitution, chronic illness, childlessness, the death of loved ones, or ugly deformity can crush even the strongest soul. And you'll actually kind of walk this back even or make some more distinctions later on. Yet Aristotle immediately balances this concession to fortune with a striking affirmation of the sovereignty of virtue. So here we go. The sovereignty of virtue. The good man is never simply a victim of circumstances. Like a skilled general who wins victories even with an inferior army, the virtuous person will always make the best use of what is at hand. Serious misfortunes will indeed damage happiness. Aristotle never claims that virtue is fully self-sufficient in the way that Stoics later will. But they will not destroy the core activity of virtue altogether. A brave man tortured on the rack remains brave in his soul, even if he cannot fight. A just man reduced to poverty still chooses justly in whatever small transactions remain open to him. So in other words, virtue shines most brightly, paradoxically, when external conditions are hostile, just as the skill of a helmsman or a captain of a ship is most evident in a storm. Virtue shines most brightly when external conditions are hostile, just as the skill of a captain of a ship is most evident in a storm. These three qualifications, activity, completeness of life, and the need for external goods, tempered by the resilience of virtue, prevent Aristotle's account from drifting into either sentimental optimism or cynical detachment. Happiness is an achievement that belongs to embodied, social, time-bound creatures who must cooperate with fortune, yet are never wholly at its mercy. The happy life is therefore rare, difficult, and fragile, but it is also the most beautiful and distinctly human thing possible. The happy life is therefore rare, difficult, and fragile, but it is also the most beautiful and distinctively human thing possible. Happiness is acquired neither by chance nor simply by nature. We are not born just or unjust, brave or cowardly. Rather, we become so through habituation. We acquire virtues by first exercising them, just as we learn to build by building and to play the guitar by playing it. Legislators make citizens good by forming good habits in them, and the pleasure or pain that accompanies our actions reveals whether those habits are taking proper root. In chapter 9, Aristotle confronts a practical question that follows directly from the definition of happiness as virtuous activity. How do we come to possess the virtues that make such activity possible? He briskly eliminates two false answers and then defends the true one with a clarity that has shaped moral psychology ever since. First, happiness and the virtues that constitute it cannot be a gift of sheer luck or fortune. If the highest human good were something that simply happened to us without any contribution from choice and effort, the entire ethical enterprise would collapse into absurdity. Parents, teachers, and lawmakers would have nothing rational to do. We could only pray for favorable spiritual guidance. Aristotle refuses this conclusion. The things we praise and blame, admire and condemn, are precisely those that lie within our power, and virtue is a chief object of praise. In other words, your happiness lies within your own power. Your happiness lies in your power. Second, virtues are not innate in the strong sense. We are not born already just, temperate, or courageous, the way a colt is born able to stand or a sparrow is born able to fly. Nature does give us capacities: anger, desire, fear, pity. But these raw materials are indeterminate. The same natural spiritedness can become either courage or rashness. The same natural appetite can become temperance or self-indulgence. Left to itself, nature inclines in no particular moral direction. So have you ever heard the phrase, virtue is a means between two extremes? So you have cowardice on one end, meaning you haven't objected out of fear.
Lies in the middle.
And then the opposite of that is rashness, just acting out of just pure instinct to go do something that might look brave at first glance, but then you're like, oh man, that was stupid. So between cowardice and rashness lies courage, the proper mean between two extremes. And so this is why we were talking about earlier, that this isn't a mathematical fixed science, because it's up to the person themselves and their use of reason to decide, where is that courage? Where is that means? What am I supposed to do in this situation? Does that make sense? Because everybody has their own circumstances and everything else. I mean, this is one of the things. One of the main problems, I guess, on social media is when people have families, with families, put their real name on their social media accounts, go and speak the truth to power, and then they get their whole bank accounts emptied because they spoke truth to power and they get sued, a slap lawsuit or whatever else. And like, well, I spoke the truth. And it's like, yeah, well, now your kids are hungry.
Lost your job.
Lost your job. And yeah, so if you really felt called to speak the truth, maybe there's one of the things that really is, or no, I mean, that only has a certain effect, but the reality is maybe there really are certain jobs that just make sense to be celibate doing. I mean, priesthood is one of them, but there are also things that you're risking your life. I mean, creating children just to go and put yourself in such mortal danger, grave danger constantly as part of the job doesn't quite make sense. So the real cause of virtue, therefore, is habituation. It's a habit. A word whose very sound in Greek echoes character or ethos. We become builders by building, guitar players by playing the guitar, and just men by repeatedly doing just actions. The causal sequence is decisive. We do not wait until we are already just before we act justly. Rather, we first perform actions that look just under guidance, coercion, or imitation, and by repeating them in the right way, at the right time, with the right motive, we gradually reshape our desires and perceptions until just action becomes second nature and a source of delight. We actually take pleasure in doing it. This is why the formation of character belongs preeminently to the legislator. Again, back to politics, back to legislation, and what is the purpose of making laws? The lawgiver's task is not merely to punish wrongdoing after the fact, but to make citizens good in advance by compelling or encouraging the young to engage in the actions that will, over time, produce virtuous dispositions. So it's not just to punish the bad, it's to encourage, to draw the good out of the population, One of the best things people always saying in Hungary, literally no taxes for those who have 4+ children or something like that. Yeah. Encouraging young families, encouraging good acts. Good laws are the public analog of good parenting. Both orchestrate repeated practice until the soul takes on a stable bent toward the noble. A city whose laws habituate children to cowardice, greed, or flattery will inevitably produce cowardly, greedy, and servile adults. Welfare. A city that trains them to face danger nobly, to share resources fairly, and to speak truth boldly will produce brave, just, and free men. A subtle but decisive sign reveals whether habituation is proceeding correctly. The emotional tone that accompanies the actions. When someone performs a tempered act but feels pain and longing for the excess he has renounced, the habit has not yet taken proper root. But when someone performs a courageous act but is paralyzed by terror, the habit is still imperfect. By contrast, the person in whom virtue is fully formed finds that just and courageous actions are themselves pleasant, and that base alternatives have become distasteful or even repulsive. I can't but do the good. I can't live with myself, so to speak, if I don't do what's good, because to not act is to choose to be silent. Pleasure and pain are therefore not incidental side effects. They are the very medium in which character is forged. Pleasure and pain are therefore not incidental side effects. They are the very medium in which character is forged. The young must be trained to take pleasure in the right things and pain at the wrong ones, long before they can give a rational account of why. The young must be trained to take pleasure in the right things and pain at the wrong ones, long before they can give a rational account of why. Aristotle's doctrine of habituation thus bridges the gap between nature and reason. We begin as creatures of appetite and emotion, incapable of full rational choice. Through repeated guided action, we slowly transform those appetites until they come into harmony with reason. Subjecting our passions and emotion to right reason. Only then does genuinely virtuous activity chosen for its own sake because it is noble, become possible. The entire educational program of the politics and the detailed treatment of the individual virtues in books 3 through 5 will rest on this single insight. Moral excellence is an acquired second nature, patiently built up by doing until the soul itself loves what is good and hates what is bad. Now, this is for what's the natural and acquired moral virtues. Now, I'm sure those of you who have been confirmed know what's called the infused moral virtues, right? Y'all remember from your catechism classes, I'm sure. I don't need to explain it again. But the infused moral virtues are given to you together with sanctifying grace at your baptism. And these virtues are, in a sense, Father Guérin-Lagrange explains it that like a sail on a ship that's tied up. At baptism, it's like a sail tied up. You have them, but they're not yet able to exercise themselves. But at the sacrament of confirmation, that's precisely what it does. The sail is let loose. The sail is let free, and the boat is now able to sail. So that's what happens with confirmation with the infused moral virtues. Now the thing is, there's, again, the natural acquired virtues that we're talking about here, and the infused moral virtues that come by the grace of the Holy Ghost. And those virtues are able to exercise themselves completely and totally independently of the natural virtues. So someone who has habitually lived a life of lust and unchastity is able to actually live the infused moral virtue of chastity perfectly, unless he himself chooses to impede it. So in one sense, this is what people with past or whatever else that are now starting to live a good life, they have all the capacity to change, every capacity to change. But also I tell the people that have the habit of judging other people, is like, you don't understand the infused moral virtues, realizing that no matter what person's past are, there's someone completely different now. Aristotle addresses the old saying of Solon, S-O-L-O-N, that no man should be called happy until he is dead, because the temptation against chastity will finally cease just 30 minutes after you're dead, right? I don't know what saint said that, but it's funny. Because fortune can still reverse a life's outcome. He concedes that serious misfortunes can impair or destroy happiness, yet the activity of virtue remains possible even in adversity, and the good man's character is not easily changed. Thus, we may call living people happy, though with the qualification that their happiness remains vulnerable to great reversals. Solon's warning to the fabulously wealthy king Croesus, I had to look this one up, so I was like, who's this Solon guy? His warning. Count no man happy until he is dead. The story, made famous by Herodotus, was that Croesus paraded his gold, palaces, and power only to be told that a life apparently complete can still be overturned by a single turn of fortune. Again, one hurricane, one tornado. Croesus himself later lost his kingdom, his sons, and nearly his life. The adage, therefore, expresses a deep Greek anxiety. If happiness depends even partly on external goods that lie beyond our control, then no living person can ever be pronounced securely happy. I remember this when I was in Nashville. I had this room in my dorm at Belmont University. I was looking out towards downtown with the Batman building and all that kind of stuff. And I was thinking about all the connections I would need to make in order to have the career that I want. And I realized that I was completely and totally dependent and vulnerable on someone actually wanting to help me. Like I could have struck all the right hands, but if there was one person who just didn't want to help me, happiness was completely and totally impossible. So in a sense, I felt powerless. Like either happiness is completely out of my control or it's completely in my control. But if it's out of my control, there's no guarantee for it at all. No guarantee for it at all. Aristotle neither dismisses the saying nor fully endorses it. He treats it as a serious objection that must be faced squarely. He grants the premise: great and repeated misfortunes, loss of children, betrayal by friends, exile, torture, incurable disease, disgraceful death, do indeed damage or even destroy happiness. I think I mentioned all of these things in my sermon on Sunday because I was like, when I was discerning marriage and all that kind of stuff, I wrote on a piece of paper all the things that I wanted it for and realized that any tragedy could happen and take every single one of those away from me. None of them were guaranteed, not a single one. So to sign my life away for something that none of which could be guaranteed, hold on here. Let me take a double take. A man who ends his days like Priam, watching his city burn, his son slaughtered, and himself dragged to a humiliating death, cannot plausibly be called happy overall, no matter how nobly he once lived. Fortune is not a trivial factor. It can strip away the very conditions that make sustained virtuous activity possible or beautiful. Aristotle is no Stoic precursor. He refuses to say that virtue alone is sufficient for complete happiness. Yet he also refuses to let fortune have the last word. Even in the worst circumstances, the activity of virtue is not wholly extinguished. A brave man on the rack can still choose to endure with dignity. A just man in poverty can still refuse to steal or betray. A temperate man facing starvation can still refuse gluttony when food finally appears. Character, once firmly habituated, is remarkably stable. The good man does not suddenly become cowardly or vicious because the world turns against him. His soul retains its orientation toward the noble, and in that inward orientation, there remains a core of genuine, if diminished, virtuous activity. Aristotle therefore stakes out a middle position. We are permitted, indeed required, to call a living person happy if he is currently exercising complete virtue in favorable or at least tolerable circumstances. At the same time, we must always add a silent or explicit qualification. Happy, so far. Or happy as human things go. The verdict is provisional because the play is not over. New acts of misfortune can still alter the final shape of the drama. This nuanced solution reflects Aristotle's broader realism. Happiness is an achievement of a rational animal, not of a god or a beast. As such, it is necessarily exposed to the contingencies of embodied social temporal existence. We can never enjoy the absolute security that belongs only to the divine life or of pure contemplation, which is why in Book 10, Aristotle would describe that life as something separate and more than human. Yet because the core of happiness is activity in accordance with virtue, and because virtue is a stable disposition under our control, human happiness retains a remarkable resilience. It can be wounded, diminished, even ruined by fortune, but it cannot be altogether annihilated as long as a human being remains capable of rational choice. long as a human being remains capable of rational choice. Thus, Aristotle rescues both common sense and moral responsibility. We praise and emulate the living who are flourishing. We do not wait for their funerals before acknowledging their excellence. At the same time, we retain a sober humility, remembering that the final chorus has not yet spoken, and that only the whole of a life, seen from its end, reveals whether the protagonist truly deserves the prize of eudaimonia. Finally, happiness is not something praised. Praise belongs to virtue, which is within our power, but something prized and honored as divine. It is the complete and self-sufficient end of all human things. Having established that the human good is activity of soul in accordance with complete virtue, Aristotle notes that the soul has two parts capable of reason, one that contemplates and knows, and another that obeys reason in matters of appetite and desire. Virtues are accordingly of two kinds, intellectual and moral. And the next task of the inquiry is to examine the nature, number, and acquisition of moral or character virtue. Prudence, justice, temperance, fortitude, cardinal virtues. This examination will occupy Book 2 and beyond, but Book 1 has laid the indispensable foundation. Human life has an objective telos. Excellence in performing our proper function constitutes the flourishing life, and the remainder of the ethics will spell out in detail what that excellence consists in and how it is achieved. In the closing sections of Book 1, Aristotle draws the threads together and signals the path ahead. Having defended his definition of happiness, eudaimonia, through argument, common opinion, and dialectical testing, he now places it in its proper evaluative category. Happiness is not praised. Praise is reserved for virtue itself, because virtue is the excellence we achieve through effort and choice, and it is therefore the proper object of moral approval. Happiness, by contrast, is something higher. It is prized, honored, and even revered as blessed. It stands as the boundary between the human and the divine. It is the most godlike thing attainable by a mortal creature. In ordinary Greek usage, one calls blessed the gods and the very few human lives that have achieved an almost superhuman completeness. Think of the heroes whose stories ended in radiant success. Aristotle quietly adopts a language here. The happy man is as close to the gods as embodied, time-bound rationality allows. And you can think about the beatific vision, seeing God face to face. With this elevation, Aristotle reaffirms the self-sufficiency and finality of happiness. It is the ultimate for the sake of which. It is the ultimate for the sake of which. Everything else, money, honor, pleasure, even virtue itself, is chosen either for it or with a view to it. But happiness is chosen only for itself. It needs nothing added to make it more desirable. It is the complete, perfect, and self-sufficient end of all human actions. He then lays out the map of the soul that will govern the entire remainder of the ethics. The human soul is not a simple unity. It possesses reason in two distinct modes. One, the contemplative or scientific part, whose activity is theoretical understanding and whose highest excellence will later be called Sophia, or wisdom. And the second part, the calculative obedient part, the practical sense, which includes appetite and emotion, insofar as they can listen to and obey reason. Its excellence is phronensis, practical wisdom, together with the moral virtues. Prudence, justice, temperance, fortitude. Corresponding to these two rational capacities are two families of virtues: intellectual virtues, wisdom, understanding, prudence, and moral or character virtues, the stable dispositions that make feelings and actions accord with right reason. The intellectual virtues are produced chiefly by teaching and take time and experience to mature. The moral virtues, as Book 1 has already insisted, are produced by habituation. Almost done. Book 1, therefore, ends exactly where it must. Having proven that the human good is activity of soul in accordance with the best and most complete virtue in a complete life, Aristotle announces that the next urgent task is to investigate moral virtue, its genus, its species, and above all, the precise mechanism by which it is acquired. Only after we understand how courage, justice, temperance, and the rest are formed in the non-rational but reason-receptive part of the soul can we return to the higher question of how the two kinds of virtue are related, and whether the best and most complete virtue is ultimately the practical ensemble of the statesman or the contemplative activity of the philosopher. That final resolution will not come until Book 10, Lecture 14, and we're on Lecture 10 right now. But the agenda is now clear. Thus, Book 1 is far more than a preliminary sketch. It is the keystone of the entire arch, of the entire book. It establishes, against sophists and skeptics, that human life has an objective, discoverable telos. Against Plato, that this telos is immanent in human nature, in action, rather than a separate form or in some other reality, dimension. Against hedonists and careerists, that the telos is neither pleasure nor honor, but excellent rational activity. And against both optimists and pessimists, that the achievement is difficult, fragile, and dependent on both effort and fortune, yet genuinely possible for embodied rational animals living in cities. Everything that follows, the doctrine of the mean, the catalog of the individual virtues, the analysis of friendship, pleasure, and the contemplative life, will be an elaboration, defense, and hierarchical ordering of the foundation laid in these 13 short chapters. Emphasis on short. Book 1 does not merely begin the Nicomachean ethics. It determines its shape and its ultimate destination. Any questions?
How long did it take him to write all this?
Like 6 hours. Oh, no, me? These? It was like him, I don't know.
I was like, did he know where he was going at the very beginning?
Should we say a prayer real quick before you head out? Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost. It was in the beginning, is now, and never shall be, world without end. Amen. Mary, seat of wisdom,
Pray for us.
and the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen.